So what I've done here is what I do always when I bind my quilt. I lay my quilt face down on the floor of my sewing room, and I put the binding on, and I put a pin in to hold it at the starting point, and then I work my way around, crawling around on the floor, and I check every corner of my quilt to make sure that there aren't going to be any seams in the binding directly on the corner, because as you know, that would add bulk and be kind of funky. So I got lucky on my first try, and I've got my binding all laid out, and up here is where it's going to overlap, and you can see that my my calculation was very good for having plenty of binding, and so I can bind my strips. So this is the point where I'm going to start sewing. I'm sorry if I'm making you seasick with this video. I've got my binding face down on my quilt, and I'm going to stitch from the back side of the quilt using my 1/4 inch foot. So this is where my starting point is going to be, and I'm going to probably use some wonder clips. Just every so often I'll put a wonder clip, and I'll stop and put clips and stop and put clips. But that's how I'm going to sew my binding on with my 1/4 inch foot. So when we come back, I'll show you a little bit of that at the machine. All right, I've got my 1/4 inch foot on my machine, and my stitch length is set at 2.0. So I'm going to take a few wonder clips and stick in here just to hold things tight. And we're going to start sewing. Give it a little back stitch. Let me get a little ways here, then we'll show you actually what's going on. So let's stop here so I can show you actually how this is going to look once we flip it over to the other side. So we have sewn the binding onto the wrong side of the quilt. And then now we can see how it's going to look when we flip it over. And you can see that we've got the flange, and we've got the darker outer binding, and then the fabric with the white background forms a flange. So I'm going to continue sewing my binding on. I stop at the corners and pivot, and to do the faux miter like a lot of you have probably done before. I'm not going to bore you with that. I'm going to go ahead and sew the rest of this binding on, and then we will. I'm going to stop when I have about 20 inches, 15 or 20 inches to play with between the two. And between the start stitching and the end stitching, I'm going to stop about 20 inches apart. And then we're going to finish this up, flip it around and join the ends and finish it up. So stay tuned. Okay, so now it's time to put our edges together. I've stitched the binding onto the quilt all the way around, and I can't resist just folding it over to look at a peek for what it's going to look like once we stitch it down. So that's what it's going to look like. But anyway, we'll see that later. So now it's time to bind our edges, or to sew our two edges together. And everybody has a technique that they like in doing this. And I have a technique that I like. And I'm just going to show you today, but you can use whatever technique you want. I like something that's surefire and easy. So that's what I'm going to go with. When I bought this shortcut binding tool, and I did use it for a while after I got it, it has this line on here for that I can use when joining my binding pieces together. And I already had this tool that a lot of you may already have. This is that classic binding tool that you see advertised in, the Annie's catalog, or, any sewing store carries it. But it didn't have the line on here where I wanted it that was on this tool that helped me do it so easily. So what I did was I took this tool and that tool, and I lined them up, and I transferred the line to my tool so that I knew where it was. So now I don't have to use this one at all. What you do is you take your pieces of binding fabric and you mark the halfway spot. So for me, the halfway spot is right here. So I take my two tails and I mark a line on there, lining up with that halfway spot. So here's the halfway spot, and I've marked a line here. and I've marked a line here. Both of these lines are perpendicular to the edge of the binding, and they line up with this center line. Okay? So next I'm going to take this binding tool that I hacked and put this extra line on. And you always want to use this binding tool with the printed side up. You do not want to use it any other way. The printed side needs to be up or you are going to be in big trouble. And trust me, I have done this. I know from experience. So the first thing I'm going to do is take this side of the and I've got my quilt, you know, wrong side up, and here's my binding. And I'm going to take and I'm going to line this line that I hacked on here from my other tool, just like this, and I'm going to take my heat-soluble pen and I'm going to draw a line along the edge of my tool. And there's like a little notch here at the end, a little straight part where it goes down. And I transferred all that right onto there. So you can see this little straight part here corresponds with this part of the ruler. And so I did that, okay? And then I'm going to take the tool, and I'm not going to turn it over because you always want to use it, you know, with the proper side up. And I am going to take it, let's see, did that right? Okay, so I'm going to take it and I'm just going to turn it around. I'm not going to flip it because you want the printed side up, and I'm going to line the line up on this end of the binding, and I'm going to mark it again with my heat-soluble pen. And a good little sanity check here, because you know we all make mistakes. A good sanity check here when you're done marking is to look at this and say, my light one is on the short side here, right? It's the shorter part of the line, and it's the longer part here. So that means you've got them lined up right. So the next thing you're going to do is take your scissors and you're going to trim these very carefully, and you want to trim this little step on here, this little straight part. Trim it just like you marked it. And you want to go up here and trim, trim, trim. Just like that. And you want to trim this one the same way. Okay. So now I've got my two edges of my binding that are ready to be joined in holy matrimony. We're ready to join them together. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a ruler and take this ruler, and I'm going to take my marking pen, and I'm going to lay this edge, this cut edge that I cut along the 1/4 inch line. And I am going to mark a 1/4 inch in, and I'll show you this up close here in a minute. I'm going to mark, let me get this, I'm going to mark a 1/4 inch in. I'm going to put a little dot right at the seam line. Did you see where I did that? I put a 1/4 inch dot right here at the seam line. Okay, so I measured a 1/4 inch in from here and made a dot. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other one. I'm going to mark a 1/4 inch in. This is, okay, 1/4 inch. And I'm going to put a little dot right there. Okay, and when we come back, we're going to be at the sewing machine. Let me hold these up so you can see. There's a 1/4 inch dot there, and a 1/4 inch dot here. Okay, and we're going to try to line those up, and that way we'll get our fabrics to line up when we do the final stitch up. So when we come back, I'll be at the machine, and I'm going to show you how to drop some pins in there and get the best outcome possible. All right, keep your iron heated up because we're going to be ironing again too. Okay, so now I'm back at my sewing machine, and I've got my two binding ends here. I put this clip on my quilt just to gather up some of this bulk to keep it out of the way. So I've got my two binding ends here, and I'm ready to attach them together. But I want to make sure that the two fabrics line up perfectly, or as close to perfect as I can get them on the seam line. So that's why I put the dot in here, the 1/4 inch dot in on each of them. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take one of my pins, and I'm going to stick it through the 1/4 inch hole on top right at the seam line, just like that. Stuck the pin in, and I'm going to have that same pin come through in the same spot on the other fabric. So you can see I've got the pin coming out of the other fabric. So now I'm going to put the 2 fabrics together very, very closely and lined up. And I'm going to stick that pin in there without moving the fabric. And that's going to give me a good chance of having my binding come out just right. So I've got the pin in there going through that sweet spot. I'm going to pin that. And I'm going to put a couple other pins in there. And I've still got my 1/4 inch foot on. And I've got my seam stitch length at 2.0. And I'm going to stitch this and see how it comes out. And we can say a little prayer to the goddess of good seams. And see how. Pull my pins out. We don't want to sew over pins now, do we? That's not a good thing. That can have bad consequences. Let's see how we did. Oh yes, it's perfect. And you can see that my seams line up perfectly. So now what I need to do is press this seam open and press this down. In fact, I'm just gonna, it's a big old quilt. Every time I make a quilt, I think, why do I make quilts so big? You know, but something about it. Once you start adding the borders and all the gizmos and, oh, I'm gonna put an extra block on because I have extra fabric, put extra row blocks, and my goodness, you end up with a big quilt. So I'm pressing this seam open, just like this. You can wave bye-bye to that heat-soluble marker. Press it from the other side too. But dropping those pins in there and making those dots, making those little marks and dropping the pins in makes a big difference. This fabric is more forgiving because it's 2 kind of similar prints. But if you're doing something, you know, maybe red and white or something with more contrast, it's even more important that you get this right. And when you first do this, the first few times, you might get a little frustrated and think, oh gosh, you know, this is so much work. But really, once you do a few of these, to me, it's worth it not to have to do any hand sewing. Okay, so my binding is good, and it's not twisted, which is a good thing. We've all done that too, I bet, haven't we? Where we've inadvertently twisted the binding when we're joining the edges together. So now I'm going to go back to the sewing machine and I'm going to stitch this down, and then we're going to come back to the ironing board again. So go ahead, I'm going to stitch this down and I'm going to meet you back here at the ironing board in just a sec. Okay, I've stitched the binding down where it was still unattached, and it looks great. So now I've got my iron heated up, pretty, you know, cotton with steam, high heat, and I'm going to go all the way around my quilt, and I'm going to press this binding out flat. Okay, so I'm just going around the edges, and I'm going to press the binding out flat. And even at this corner, I'm going to push it out, push with my iron, push it out, and press it flat. I'm going to go all the way around the quilt. So that's the next step.